In September of 1991, two German hikers in the Ötztal Alps stumbled across a body half buried in the ice. They assumed it was a modern climbing accident. They were wrong by about 5,300 years. The man frozen in that glacier, later named Ötzi, would go on to become the most studied corpse in human history. For more than 3 decades, scientists have built an extraordinarily detailed picture of who he was, what he looked like, where his ancestors came from, and even how he died. Museum reconstructions, documentary films, school textbook entries, they all painted the same portrait. A weather-beaten European mountain man with light brown skin, long shaggy hair flowing past his shoulders, and a thick, scraggly beard. The face that millions of people have seen behind glass in northern Italy. The problem is, that face is fiction. In August of 2023, a team of geneticists at the Max Planck Institute resequenced Ötzi's genome from scratch. And what they pulled out of that 5,300-year-old DNA didn't match the museum reconstruction. It didn't match the textbook entries. It didn't match anything scientists had told us about this man for 30 years. Ötzi wasn't pale, he wasn't hairy, and his ancestors weren't who we thought they were. The most famous prehistoric corpse on the planet has been wearing the wrong face since the day he was put on display. If you've ever taken comfort in the idea that science always lands close to the truth, this story is going to make you uncomfortable. And if you've always quietly suspected that those neat little museum reconstructions are mostly educated guessing dressed up as fact, you're going to feel very vindicated by the end of this video. Either way, by the time we're done, you're going to look at the most famous mummy on Earth completely differently. So stick around. Because the real Ötzi was a very different man from the one in the textbooks. To understand just how wrong the picture was, you need to understand how it got built in the first place. So let's go back to that September afternoon in 1991. Erika and Helmut Simon were a German couple in their late 40s, hiking through a high pass on the border between Austria and Italy. The weather had been unusually warm that year, and glaciers across the Alps were melting back at record speed, exposing rocks and crevasses that hadn't seen daylight in millennia. As they descended from the pass, Helmut spotted something brown sticking out of a meltwater pool a few meters off the trail. He thought, at first, it was a discarded doll left by another hiker. Then he looked again and realized he was staring at a human head and shoulders, frozen into the bottom of the slush. The skin was tanned brown and leathery. The back of the skull was exposed. The body was face down, and one arm was bent at an unnatural angle beneath it. The Simons assumed they had found a recent climbing victim, a hiker who had slipped into a crevasse and gotten trapped, then surfaced when the ice melted. They snapped a single photograph, reported the find to Austrian authorities at the nearest mountain hut, and continued down the mountain. That photo, taken on a tourist camera, is now one of the most historically significant images in modern archaeology, even though the Simons had absolutely no idea what they had just found. The next morning, a rescue team came up to extract what everyone assumed was a routine body recovery, and what followed was an absolute disaster. They used a jackhammer to break the ice around him. They tore through ancient clothing they didn't recognize as ancient. They damaged the body. They damaged everything around the body. Because nobody, not the rescuers, not the police, not the medical examiners who arrived later, realized that they were handling something extraordinary. The body had no obvious modern clothing on it, no boots, no zippers, no synthetic fibers. But it wasn't until forensic experts noticed a strange copper axe lying near the corpse that the truth started to creep in. That axe didn't belong to any modern hiker. It didn't belong to anyone who had been alive within the last several millennia. When carbon dating came back from the lab a few weeks later, it rewrote the entire find. The body was around 5,300 years old, older than the Egyptian pyramids, older than Stonehenge, in the form we recognize today, older than the invention of the wheel across much of Europe. This was the best preserved natural human mummy ever recovered from prehistory. A complete person, with skin and organs and stomach contents and tattoos and clothing, dropped almost intact out of a time period we usually only know through pottery fragments and broken bones. Within weeks, Ötzi, a name a journalist gave him after the valley where he was found, became a worldwide phenomenon. Researchers from dozens of disciplines descended on his frozen remains. He was eventually moved to a custom-built refrigerated chamber at the South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano, Italy, where he still rests today, kept at a constant -6 degrees Celsius and 99% humidity to keep his ancient skin from disintegrating. And then the picture started to come together. To put a face on the most famous corpse in the world, the museum commissioned 2 Dutch paleo artists named Alphonse and Adrie Kennis, twin brothers who specialize in building hyper-realistic models of prehistoric humans. They used everything science had at the time: skeletal measurements, surviving skin samples, CT scans of the skull, and an early generation of DNA analysis. The result, unveiled to the public in the early 2010s, was a 1.6-meter-tall man with deep-set brown eyes, weather-cracked light brown skin, long brown hair down past his shoulders, and a thick, scraggly beard. He looked, for all the world, like a Bronze Age shepherd who had wandered out of a fantasy novel. That face became the face of European prehistory. It appeared in countless documentaries. It was the cover image on textbooks. It was reproduced in school exhibitions across Europe and North America. For an entire generation of students, that figure was what their ancient European ancestor looked like. And almost nobody questioned it, because it was sitting in a serious museum, attached to a real body, supported by real DNA evidence. But there were always quiet questions about whether the reconstruction was really accurate. The original DNA study, done in 2012 by a team led by Albert Zink at the European Academy of Bolzano, had told scientists a lot of solid things about Ötzi: that he had brown eyes, that his blood type was O, that he was lactose intolerant, that he was genetically predisposed to heart disease, which lined up with the hardened arteries radiologists could already see on his scans. Those broad strokes seemed rock solid, but the fine details, exactly how dark his skin was, exactly how much hair he had, exactly what mix of ancient populations his ancestors came from, those were estimates. And as we're about to see, estimates can be very, very wrong. Before we get to what the 2023 reanalysis actually revealed, you need to understand just how much was learned, or believed to be learned, about this man over 30 years of study, because that's what makes the eventual reveal so jarring. Ötzi didn't die peacefully. In 2001, a full decade after his discovery, an Italian radiologist named Paul Gostner spotted something on a CT scan that every previous examiner had missed: a small flint arrowhead lodged in Ötzi's left shoulder, just under the shoulder blade. It had severed an artery. This man had bled to death, fast, on that mountainside. He was murdered. Further investigation turned up more wounds. A deep cut on the palm of his right hand, all the way to the bone. The kind of injury you get from grabbing a blade in self-defense. Defensive bruising on his wrists. Blunt force trauma to the back of his head, possibly from a fall, possibly from a final killing blow after the arrow had already brought him down. His last meal, preserved with eerie perfection in his stomach contents, thanks to the freezing of his body within hours of death, turned out to be ibex meat, red deer meat, einkorn wheat, and traces of a toxic fern that may have been used as a primitive medicine. He had eaten that meal just a few hours before he died. Pollen samples extracted from his gut showed he had moved through 3 completely different altitude zones in the final 33 hours of his life, dropping into a forested valley and then climbing back up into the high alpine, a pattern that strongly suggested he was on the run from someone when he was finally killed. So a picture started to form, and it was a remarkably specific one. Ötzi was about 45 years old when he died, which was old for his era. He stood roughly 5'3" and weighed about 110 pounds. He carried a copper-headed axe, which marked him as someone of unusually high status in his community, because copper was extraordinarily rare and difficult to produce in his world. His body was covered in 61 tattoos, made by rubbing charcoal into small incisions in his skin almost all of them clustered around joints and along his spine. Researchers concluded the tattoos were therapeutic rather than decorative, possibly one of the earliest known forms of acupuncture-like medicine. He suffered from Lyme disease. He had advanced tooth decay. His knees were worn down from a lifetime of walking on steep terrain. He was lactose intolerant, like most people of his era. He had a fight. He fled into the high mountains. He was caught and shot in the back with an arrow from below. He fell into a small rocky gully where the cold preserved him while glaciers swept over him for the next 53 centuries. To this day, nobody knows who killed him or why. There are theories. Some researchers believe the murder was the end of a personal dispute, possibly tied to the wealth and status implied by his copper axe. Others have pointed out that the arrow shaft was deliberately pulled from the wound after the shot, which would have caused massive additional blood loss, suggesting the killer wanted to recover the arrow to avoid being identified by it. Whoever shot Ötzi knew him, knew the terrain, and was careful enough to clean up after the killing. The most famous murder in prehistory remains technically a cold case 5,300 years old, and the level of detail didn't stop at his body. His clothing and equipment, miraculously preserved alongside him, gave researchers an almost complete inventory of a Copper Age mountain traveler's kit. He wore a coat woven from alternating strips of dark and light goat hide, leggings of goatskin, a loincloth of sheepskin, a bearskin hat tied under his chin with a leather strap, and shoes with bearskin soles, deerskin uppers, and a netted inner sock stuffed with grass for insulation. He carried a yew wood longbow, partially unfinished, suggesting he was actively working on it in the days before he died. He had a quiver of 14 arrows, only 2 of which were finished and fletched. He carried a flint dagger, a wooden-handled retoucheur for sharpening blades, a small leather pouch containing tinder and dried fungus for making fire, and pieces of birch polypore, a medicinal fungus believed to treat parasitic infections, which we now know Ötzi had. Every single object told part of the story of his final days. Every single object reinforced the sense that we knew this man. This was the man. Meticulously, almost cinematically reconstructed by science. A real human being from 3300 BCE who had been given a name, a face, a personal history, and a tragic final day. He felt knowable. He felt almost like someone you could pick out of a crowd. But there was a problem with all of it. Or at least with a critical piece of it. And nobody knew that problem existed until 2023. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. And to explain what went wrong, I need to back up for a second and talk about how ancient DNA actually works, because it's important for what's about to happen. When scientists extract genetic material from a mummy or a skeleton thousands of years old, the DNA is heavily degraded. It exists only in tiny broken fragments, mixed in with environmental contamination, bacteria, fungi, and crucially, the DNA of every modern human who has ever handled the body. In 1991, when that Austrian rescue team chiseled Ötzi out of the ice with a jackhammer, they had no idea they were contaminating the most important genetic sample of the century. Over the years, dozens of researchers handled him. Some wore gloves, some didn't. Some breathed on the exposed samples. Some accidentally dropped sweat onto his bare skin. When the first proper genome sequencing was done in 2012, it was a heroic technical achievement for the time. But the technology was still young, and the genome that came out the other end had a problem that the scientists involved couldn't see. It was contaminated. Specifically, it was contaminated with modern European DNA. Modern European DNA from the kind of researchers most likely to be working in a European lab. And when those modern fragments got mixed into the assembly of the ancient genome, they pulled Ötzi's apparent ancestry slowly toward modern Europeans. They lightened his apparent skin tone. They blended in genetic signals from populations he had no actual connection to. For more than a decade, nobody realized this had happened. The 2012 genome was the gold standard. It was cited in hundreds of papers. It informed the Kennis brothers' reconstruction. It set the picture of Ötzi that the entire world saw. Then, in August of 2023, everything changed. A new team, led again by Albert Zink, this time working with geneticist Johannes Krauske from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology, decided to take advantage of the enormous improvements in ancient DNA sequencing that had happened over the preceding 10 years. They re-extracted DNA from a sample of Ötzi's hip bone. They used updated techniques specifically designed to filter out modern contamination. They compared his DNA against a much larger reference database of both ancient and modern genomes, and they sequenced him at much higher coverage, meaning they read every part of his genome many more times over, so they could clearly distinguish real ancient signal from modern noise. The results landed in the journal Cell Genomics on August 16, 2023. And they were stunning. Here's what the DNA actually said. The first thing the new genome revealed was that Ötzi's skin was much, much darker than anyone had previously realized. Not lightly tanned, not just weather-darkened from a life outdoors, genetically dark. The specific variants in his DNA that determined skin pigmentation, the same variants that geneticists use today to predict appearance from ancient samples, pointed to a complexion closer to what we describe today as Mediterranean to Middle Eastern, and possibly darker than anyone currently alive in modern Europe. In fact, the new analysis suggested his skin tone was the darkest ever recorded for any European individual from his era. And here's the kicker. The leathery brown color preserved on his mummy, which scientists had always attributed to thousands of years of mummification and oxidation in the ice, turned out to be much, much closer to his actual living complexion than anyone had ever thought. He didn't darken in death. He had always been that color. The mummy you can see through the museum glass today is, in terms of skin tone, a far more honest representation of Ötzi than the polished, lightened reconstruction standing next to him in the same building. The reconstruction in the museum, the light brown-skinned mountain man, was simply wrong. And this finding alone has ripple effects far beyond Ötzi himself. For decades, the assumption baked into nearly every popular depiction of ancient Europeans was that as humans moved north out of Africa and into colder climates, their skin lightened relatively quickly. Ötzi was supposed to be a representative of that already lightened northern population. The 2023 data says he wasn't lightened at all, which means the genetic shift toward pale skin in Europe happened much later than the textbook timeline suggested. The pale-skinned, pale-eyed Europeans of stereotype didn't really emerge until thousands of years after Ötzi was already dead. The image most people carry around of what a prehistoric European looked like is, in a very real sense, a projection of much more recent populations backwards into time periods where it simply doesn't belong. The second revelation was, in some ways, even more jarring. Ötzi was not the long-haired, thickly bearded figure on display in Bolzano. The new genome showed that he carried genetic variants strongly associated with male pattern baldness. In life, Ötzi had very little hair on his head. He was, in all probability, almost completely bald, with maybe a fringe around the sides. The long, flowing hair on the museum reconstruction had been an assumption based on a few hairs found in the vicinity of the body. Hairs that, in retrospect, may not even have been his. Many of them likely came from his clothing, which was sewn from multiple animal hides, or from contamination at the find site. So the famous face, the face on textbook covers, and museum brochures, and documentary thumbnails, got two enormous things wrong. Wrong skin, wrong hair, the two most visually distinctive features of the reconstruction, both of them incorrect. But that wasn't even the most important finding. The third revelation was the one that rewrote not just Ötzi's identity, but the story of who lived in Central Europe 5,300 years ago. The 2012 study had concluded that Ötzi was a mix of two ancestral populations. Early European farmers who had originally come from Anatolia, blended with earlier Western hunter-gatherers, plus a small fraction of so-called steppe pastoralist ancestry mixed in. That steppe's ancestry was significant. It was the genetic signature of a population that began sweeping westward across Europe roughly 5,000 years ago from the grasslands north of the Black Sea, bringing horses, wheels, dairying, and a new genetic profile that would eventually mix into nearly every modern European. The 2023 reanalysis found something completely different. Ötzi had almost no steppe ancestry at all. His genome was overwhelmingly, over 90%, derived from early Anatolian farmers. The steppe component found in the 2012 study had been contamination. Specifically, contamination from modern Europeans handling the samples, who of course all carry that steppe signal in their own DNA in varying amounts today. A tiny amount of their genetic material had leaked into the assembly, and that tiny amount had been enough to fundamentally misrepresent who Ötzi was. I want you to sit with this for a second, because this is the part that really matters. If Ötzi was almost purely Anatolian farmer in his ancestry, it means that the community he lived in was isolated. While steppe migrants were apparently already moving into other parts of Europe at this point in prehistory, the population in Ötzi's Alpine Valley had remained genetically separate, holding on to a much older ancestry that traced directly back to the very first farmers who crossed from the Near East into Europe thousands of years earlier. He wasn't just one man with a surprise genome. He was a window into an entire population that had been hiding in plain sight in the high Alps. A community completely missed by every previous study of European prehistory. Think about that for a moment. The most studied human remains in archaeology, examined for 30 years by some of the best scientists in the world, turned out to be a representative of a population nobody had even known to look for. He had been sitting in a glass case in Bolzano the whole time, holding the secret in his bones. And that finding doesn't just change Ötzi's biography. It changes the timeline of one of the most consequential migrations in human history. Here's the context you need. Roughly 9,000 years ago, a wave of early farmers began moving out of Anatolia, what is today Turkey, into southeastern Europe, bringing wheat, barley, sheep, goats, and the entire agricultural package with them. Over the next few thousand years, they pushed north and west, gradually replacing or mixing with the hunter-gatherer populations they encountered. By around 5,000 years ago, a second wave, the steppe pastoralists from north of the Black Sea, began pushing into Europe from the east, bringing horses, wheels, dairy farming, and probably the early Indo-European languages. This second wave eventually mixed into nearly every modern European population. The standard story said both waves had clearly reached the Alps by Ötzi's time. The 2023 reanalysis says no, that the Anatolian farmer descendants in his region had successfully held on to their genetic identity right up to and through his lifetime, completely untouched by the steppe migration that was reshaping the rest of the continent. For years, scientists have argued about exactly when steppe ancestry penetrated into Central and Southern Europe. The conventional model said it had largely spread across most of the continent by Ötzi's era. The 2023 finding suggests that's not quite right, that there were pockets, particularly in mountainous regions, where the older Anatolian farmer populations persisted long after the steppe migration was supposedly underway. Ötzi isn't an outlier so much as he is a witness. He's testifying across 5,000 years that the genetic map of prehistoric Europe was patchier, more isolated, and more complicated than the standard story had ever allowed. So now, picture the real Ötzi, not the figure in the museum. Picture a bald, dark-skinned, wiry 45-year-old man, small in stature, just over 5'3". His face is weathered by mountain sun and decades of hard living. He wears a goatskin coat, leggings stitched together from multiple animal hides, a bearskin cap, and shoes stuffed with grass for insulation. He carries a copper axe that marks him as someone of importance in his community. His arms, his back, and his legs are dotted with 61 charcoal tattoos clustered around his aching joints. He speaks a language no living person has heard, and genetically, he is nothing like the average modern European. He is, instead, one of the last clear echoes of the very first wave of farmers who brought agriculture into Europe from the Near East, a population that, in his Alpine Valley, had survived in near isolation for thousands of years after the rest of the continent had moved on. That is the real Ötzi. and almost everything you've ever seen of him has been wrong. It's worth lingering on just how strange that is. Reconstruct any other historical figure, Cleopatra, Julius Caesar, Henry Fay, and you're working from coins, paintings, written descriptions, and contemporary accounts that vary in accuracy but exist. With Ötzi, we have the man himself, perfectly preserved. We have his actual skin, his actual organs, his actual DNA. There is no medieval painter's interpretations in the way. There is no contemporary historian to second guess. And yet, somehow, the version of him most people knew was still wrong. Not in some minor footnote way, but wrong about the most basic, visible facts of his appearance and ancestry. If we can be that wrong about a man we literally have in front of us, what does that say about everyone we don't have? Now, before we wrap this up, it's worth taking a step back and asking the obvious question: how did science get this so wrong for so long? Because 30 years is a lot of years. The short version is that ancient DNA analysis in the early 2010s was at the absolute bleeding edge of what was technically possible. The fact that anyone could pull anything coherent out of a 5D 300-year-old genome was at the time an extraordinary feat. But extraordinary for the time is not the same as correct. Early ancient DNA studies have produced a lot of results that were later overturned by better techniques. Ötzi is just the most famous example. Recent reanalyses of Neanderthal genomes, of ancient European hunter-gatherers, of various Egyptian mummies, even of ancient American remains, have all shifted significantly as the technology has matured. What's more uncomfortable, though, is the fact that the visual reconstruction in the museum, the model, was treated by the public as if it were essentially a photograph, when it was really just an educated guess on top of an educated guess. Paleo artists make choices based on the science that's available, and when the science changes, the model behind the glass becomes a historical document of what we used to believe. The Kenneth brothers' Ötzi is now a snapshot of how scientists understood ancient Europeans in the early 2010s, not a portrait of the man himself. There's also a deeper lesson buried in this story about how knowledge gets locked in. Once a reconstruction enters the public consciousness, through documentaries, through textbooks, through viral social media posts, it becomes very, very hard to dislodge, even when the underlying science has moved on. The bearded mountain man image of Ötzi has been viewed by hundreds of millions of people. The corrected dark-skinned, bald image has been seen by a tiny fraction of that audience. Even if every museum on Earth updated their reconstructions tomorrow, the original picture would continue to circulate online for years, possibly decades. That science doesn't just live in the literature. It lives in our heads, in the form of vivid mental images that are extremely resistant to revision. This is worth remembering the next time you walk past any reconstruction of a prehistoric human in any museum anywhere. The science is improving fast, and the figures behind the glass are almost always one generation of analysis away from being out of date, which raises a question no archaeologist really wants to answer out loud. If Ötzi was this wrong for 30 years, who else have we been looking at wrong? The genome of nearly every ancient European mummy and skeleton, analyzed before about 2018, was sequenced using techniques that we now know were prone to contamination from modern handlers. Many of those analyses have never been redone. Many of those museum reconstructions are still on display. Somewhere in a glass case in a European museum right now, there is almost certainly another famous ancient face that doesn't actually match the person it's supposed to represent. And we just don't know it yet, because nobody has gotten around to resequencing them. Ötzi is the most studied corpse in human history. If he could hide his real identity in plain sight for 3 decades, the chances that he's the only one are essentially zero. There are probably several Ötzis sitting behind museum glass right now, waiting for their turn. Faces we trust because they've been printed in books and projected onto documentary screens. Faces that the next generation of DNA technology is going to quietly take apart and rebuild. And there's one more uncomfortable implication that the 2023 study forces us to confront. Ötzi's revised genome is dramatically different from what the world had been told. But the people who study him, the geneticists, the museum staff, the educators, have all known about this finding since August of 2023. The reconstruction in Bolzano is still there. The textbook images are still in circulation. The documentaries with the long-haired, light-skinned mountain man are still streaming, still being recommended to school children as accurate depictions of prehistoric life. Updating a famous reconstruction is slow, expensive, and politically awkward, because admitting that the old one was wrong implicitly admits that the methods used to make it weren't as reliable as they were presented. So the old face lingers, the wrong face. And every day that lingers is another day that the public image of our shared deep history drifts further from what the actual evidence now says. If this story unsettled you, you should know that Ötzi isn't the only ancient mummy whose secrets have only recently been forced into the open. The Tarim mummies of Western China, discovered in the early 1900s with strikingly European-looking features, wool clothing, and red and blonde hair, were assumed for over a century to be European migrants who had somehow ended up deep in the heart of Asia. Their DNA, finally sequenced in 2021, told a completely different story.